Support the show by donating at themusicbuds.com. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Music Buds podcast. This is episode number 25, and my name is Henry. This week, I'm honored to be joined by composer Rich Vreeland, also known as Disasterpeace, who has worked on the films It Follows, Under the Silver Lake, Netflix's Triple Frontier, as well as having worked in video games, television, and theater. Rich, it means so much for you to be taking the time. I've really have cherished your work for a long time, and so thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, how's life these days for you?
Life's pretty good. I've been in North Carolina visiting with my family for the month of November. Normally, I'm in Los Angeles, so just felt like it was a good. It would be nice to get out of Los Angeles for a little bit and just chill, slow down a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm on the countryside right now,
oh, nice.
And hopefully this internet will maintain our conversation.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first question is, how did you get started in music? Because I feel like, especially with composing for, video games, music, video games and film, I feel like there are a lot of different avenues to which that could begin.
For sure. Yeah. My path is sort of strange and specific, but starting early, like I grew up in a musical family, but for me, I was primarily interested in design, graphic design and drawing and visual art. That was sort of my primary interest for the beginning of my life. Got into web design, stuff like that. And that was sort of my trajectory. That's what I went to college for. But I got into music late. I got into music in high school. I started playing guitar, taking lessons, started writing music. And so when I was away at college studying graphic design, I was still, I was writing music more and more as a hobby. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got to this weird situation at my college where I decided to go into this major that was a Bachelor of Science, not a Bachelor of Arts. And so suddenly I saw the trajectory of the curriculum going in this very different direction that I didn't want to go in.
Sure.
And I couldn't really switch or get out of it. So it was sort of an opportunity for me to basically drop out and get a do-over. So That's what I did.
Yeah. Well, now I do want to get to some of your film work, but before that you had worked on a lot of video games and you continue to do so. And so the games like Fez, the puzzle platform game, and Hyper Light Drifter, I mean, the list goes on and on. What is it like doing music for that kind of game? Does it kind of create a non-linear kind of way of composing music? Is it an interesting medium to do music for?
Yeah, it's very intellectually, it's very challenging. It's hard. It's especially hard if you don't have a clear sense of what the overarching structure of the game is or the narrative. If that's still kind of in flux, there's only so much that you can effectively do. I find that I work best when I have a really clear sense of that. So on a project like Fez, for the most part, the structure of the game, the way the levels are laid out, the way that you move between the spaces, that was all kind of set, as well as the flow of the experience was more or less set. So I had a pretty clear sense of that, and that goes a long way in thinking on a macro level about how all these disparate elements of music are all going to work together. And for me, as I think writing music for games, that's an extremely important part. I mean, it's important in movies too, but in games, because they tend to be these nonlinear experiences and things may or may not be heard in different orders or, for different lengths of time. They're just a lot of considerations that go into it that you wouldn't see in another medium.
Yeah.
So, there was definitely initially work done, like say on Hyper Light Drifter, where the structure of that took a long time to come together. That made it difficult to work on. Fortunately, we even though the locations and how you move about the world wasn't set for a while, we at least knew what the core mechanics of the game were fairly early.
Mm-hmm.
And the aesthetic was set pretty early too. So I had a lot to work off of as far as getting the general sense of it. But it did take a lot of time to figure out, okay, now how is this going to be experienced over the course of the entire game? How am I going to weave all of this music together? Like what's going to make it, like what's going to glue it together essentially?
Mm-hmm. With that being said, do you see footage of the game before doing the music, or is it like sometimes like a film where you might get a script and you can start coming up with ideas? Like, was what you were just talking about, is that like you seeing stuff on screen, or is that more just you see like concept art and discussions?
It's the actual game as it's being built. So when I first started working on games, I wasn't my level of involvement was a little bit more detached.
Hmm.
In certain sort of environments that can be the case where you're brought in to just create music assets, like write this piece and then just deliver it to them.
Sure.
And so you may be somewhat removed from the development process. I found that to be I found that to hinder my ability to work effectively. And it also had the downside of sometimes you'd write something for a specific level or specific situation. The game would come out and then that music would be in the wrong place, or they had decided to move it somewhere else. And I was just not privy to that.
Right.
So pretty early on, I felt like, okay, I want to be as embedded in this process as I can be. So for me, that meant, however the developers were iterating on this project, I wanted to be a part of that process. And so for most game development, it's using some kind of version control software where the project is stored in a central repository that everybody can access, check out individual files to change, and then submit them. And then there's just like a record of all the things that have been changed. And every day you can go and you can just get the most recent version of the game. And this way also I could, feel empowered to, implement the music and sounds in some cases on my own, with help, obviously, especially in the beginning. At this point now, I'm pretty familiar with the technology and know how to do stuff. But in the beginning, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I needed a lot of guidance. But all of that went a long way in helping me to not feel like I'm blocked or hindered by being sort of removed from the process of the game being made.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I did not know any of that process, so that's a pretty cool thing to think about. And now, did that, in terms of becoming more involved, for lack of a better term, did that change when you got to It Follows? How did that project come about? I guess just to start with.
Yeah, I think I can answer your first question. I mean, it's for a long time I've been working on games almost exclusively, and so I had built up this process of working and this expectation that I wanted to be as deeply embedded in the project as I could be, so that I had all the tools and all the information I needed to be successful. And then it was only when I got to that point that I could start saying, okay, this is something I don't want to spend too much time on, and I can start removing elements of it that are maybe overwhelming or unnecessary. So It Follows is my first feature film project. I had done some linear media before that, but it was mostly like a little cartoon or like a short film or something like that. So for me, it was an education, and I wanted to be embedded. I wasn't completely embedded. Like there were things that I didn't get around to until subsequent projects. Like on the Silver Lake, I actually got to go on set and really sort of see how things happen.
Oh,
also,
cool.
and It Follows, it was like it was run in sort of an unorthodox manner. So it sort of created certain expectations in me about the way that films are made that ended up being more of a one-off experience and not more of an exception than a rule. So yeah, I mean, that all being said, I've found that the process on movies that works best for me is having a really strong, close relationship with the director, where we're maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be close, like in a friendship sense, but just that we're in regular contact with each other, and I know where they stand on the work that I'm doing, and I know where I stand
Right.
in the context of everything, and that often means sharing music that I'm writing for different scenes and stuff, and then getting notes and feedback pretty quickly, and having conversations about it, because when you're talking about it, other things come up, and it really helps. I mean, because in some ways, like being a composer on a film, you're kind of like a psychologist. Like you kind of have to
Right.
understand the director. So having those conversations is really goes a long way, and starting to kind of understand the psyche of the person that you're working with, the person who is kind of, you have to, you're funneling your choices through.
Yeah. And I wanted to make sure to pass on to you. So, like, I mean, of course, I love all your work, but with It Follows, I think that took so many people by like complete surprise. And I wanted to tell you that whenever those movies have been talked about, like the Silver Lake and It Follows, your music always comes up. People like that's something that whenever those movies are discussed, people are like, "Oh, the score is so good," and it still is now. We'll bring up those movies, and we always talk about your music. So I just wanted to make sure you knew how much we appreciated it.
Awesome. Yeah, I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we had no idea like that It Follows was going to be successful in the way that it was. I mean, it was David's second movie. It was my first movie that I'd ever done. I mean, I was just happy to be part of that process because I'd never been a part of it before. So yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. Now, I remember you having mentioned in the past that you said you valued science, or excuse me, not science. Total brain fart there. You valued.
I mean, I do value science, but I don't remember saying that.
Yeah.
Explicitly.
Me too. I value science as well. Should get that out there. You valued silence in
silence. Yes.
Yeah. Excuse me. Is that still true? Is that still an important part of how you go about certain projects?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, silence it's a huge part of music. I mean, yeah, it's one of the most important elements. I mean, if you kind of break it down to the core elements of music, I mean, silence has got to be a big chunk of that. Yeah, I think in my own experiences, I think this came a lot from playing games. I started to notice independent games that use silence. It's just kind of evoked a certain feeling in me that I wasn't used to, because traditionally most video games either had no music or repetitive music that never goes away, that slowly drives you insane.
Right.
So when I started to see these games coming out, where the music was treated in a different way, music that comes in subtly and leaves subtly, gives you space. Having space, it makes, when the music is actually there, it just makes the music more impactful. You notice it more and you appreciate it more because you're not fatigued by it. So, I mean, all of that was really inspiring to me, seeing that in games. The game that I think of is this independent game called Knit Stories. That that one definitely comes to mind. So that definitely like inspired me when I was working on Fez and Hyperlight Drifter. I think in there as well, but the sort of creative process that I've worked under on movies has been a little bit more paint by the numbers. It's been a little more templated and structured. Usually using temp music as a way of communicating with the director. So having really strong structural cues from the creative team about how the music should function, and then leaving the details to me.
Yeah. And I remember like having had discussions in the past where people will say something like music should almost be the same as editing, where the best kind is the ones that you don't notice, which I think in some ways is true, because like you were just saying, some music that can go along very subtly with whether it be games or movies can work really well. But then also I think there are scores that you should notice and are great because of it. Like, and I think your music speaks to that. Like Under the Silver Lake, which is like one of the coolest movies, and that score is so intertwined in that story, because it's this huge world and it goes to so many different places and locations and characters. Was doing that movie a fairly ambitious task?
Yeah, that would be an understatement. It was it was probably the hardest project I've ever done. I spent about a year and a half on that project, and it was my first time writing for orchestra. And I didn't really have any idea how to do that. I did a little bit of like production with samples and stuff. And so that's kind of where I started. And then David, the director, had a relationship with a orchestral composer he'd worked on his first movie, and he connected us. And his name is Kyle Newmaster, and I relied on him a lot to. He basically became the score producer, and he helped me navigate that whole landscape, work with players and arrangement and parts preparation and all the technical kind of stuff that goes into working with an orchestra. There was something else that you said, but I can't remember what it was.
I guess like because that movie is so mysterious and it has so many different threads, like plot lines. Was that a kind of an exciting opportunity to have so many different possibilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I remember now that you were talking about like music being kind of in the forefront versus like music not being noticed. I think that, I think it really depends. Well, I don't know. I think for sound design, that I hear that a lot for sound design. I think it rings true to me. It rings true maybe a little bit more for sound design, just because there are times when something you don't notice it because you're not, maybe as an audience member, you're either you take it for granted or you're not trained to listen for it, or it just feels like it's part of the world and it feels real, or it feels tactile. It feels, it feels like it's just a part of it. And that can be a good thing. I think with music, if you don't notice it, it's true that it can be performing some kind of function, but from the artistic perspective, like I don't ever want to write music that's not noticed. Like to me, that's a waste of time. Like just have an artificial intelligence write that music. Like why should humans be doing that? So
that's a great point. Yeah.
So, but I mean, like kind of piggybacking off of that and thinking about Under the Silver Lake, and it follows like the style between David, the director, and Julio, the editor, and Mike Jalakis, the director of photography, like their style, like it creates, they have this particular style working together that leaves all this space for music. And so as a composer, it's like kind of a dream come true to have that much of a canvas to paint with, and to kind of be put in this position to be asked to have the score basically be another character in the movie, like a main character. And that's like that's not always the case. Oftentimes it's not the case at all. So it's really nice to be able to do that, and it makes the movie better. And especially in these genre movies, it absolutely makes the movie better, because you're really just empowering the composer to fill in certain blanks, and to like better underline certain things, and to just carry the message of the movie more strongly by not like hiding the music away where nobody can pay attention to it. That's like a big pet peeve of mine, when someone did some fantastic music for a movie, but you can't hear it, or they, they're not willing to like really go for it and push that music when it's a musical moment. Like if there's some, like wide shot of like landscape or something, like, that's probably a musical moment if there's music. So, sure. I've seen lots of different sort of, scenarios like that where things don't always go in a way that could probably benefit the film.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because like, I think with anybody thinking back to like, their favorite movie scores or video game scores, it's like, you don't think of the ones you barely noticed. You think of, you think of something like It Follows or Under the Silver Lake. And so that's a good way of putting it. Now, you also did last year, you did Triple Frontier with JC Chandor. How did that project come about?
I think it was the editor who was a fan of my music, and when they were looking for a composer, because JC's normal collaborator decided they didn't want to work on the film, and it was a very different kind of project for me. It was a big studio movie. It was an action movie, so there was some novelty there that I was, piqued by a little bit. It was a very challenging project for reasons that are different than almost any other project I've ever worked on. And a lot of that had to do with the scale of the production. That it made it so that there were just a lot of cooks there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen, maybe not creatively all the time, but there were just a lot of layers of abstraction between me and decisions sometimes, and that didn't always make it easy to work effectively or to understand my standing amidst things. So there was a political element to that definitely made the work more taxing and more stressful. It was also working with a team that was across the country. So, I was in LA and they were all in New York, and that also had some challenges. It was a different creatively, it was a different way of working. JC works with a music editor, and I had never worked that way before. So it required different things of me, and sometimes it required more of me and other times it required less. And it didn't always shake out in the ways that I felt like were the most conducive to me personally, how I feel like I work best.
Sure. With kind of looking back at all your works, are you someone who enjoys listening to or being first getting into music, listening to composers, whether it be movies, video games, whatever? Are you someone who takes from that, or is it more so other parts of music?
Yeah, I think it's probably more other parts of music for me, although I have had, but it's pretty much all video game composers. And I would say it's mostly Yasunori Mitsuda, who did the Chrono Trigger games, and Koji Kondo, who did all the mainline Nintendo games of the 80s, 90s, or most of them. And then, like Metroid, stuff like that. So there's I had a lot of inspiration there, but that's that would be like a chunk of it. And then probably the bigger chunk of it would just be contemporary music of different kinds. Lots of rock and metal, jazz, and classical music too. So a different kind of composer, I suppose.
Yeah.
But then, there are soundtrack composers in there too, like Morricone, and then people that wasn't super familiar with because I was never like a film nerd or even a soundtrack nerd really. So it wasn't until I worked on Under the Silver Lake that I really had any familiarity with Bernard Herrmann, for instance. Oh, yeah. And like getting into his music was like, it was like a rite of passage. It was fantastic to kind of to discover this, this amazing composer after all this time. So yeah, that's how, I would say that a lot of it came from just my personal interests in music and being a guitar player for sure too.
Yeah. I think when I was first getting into movies and then into scores, one thing with video games especially, and I think it's just shown how the people's mindsets have changed. But like when I first started playing video games, I didn't really think about the music at all. But then having gotten older and gone back and listened to those games, it's amazing. There's so much great music in there. The ones you've talked about, as well as all these more modern franchises, and like there's a whole world of like masterful music that I feel like not enough people touch on, and it's a world that you can just kind of escape into and discover so many interesting sounds.
I also think that as far as like mediums go, outside of music by itself, I think games do more than maybe any other medium to really develop relationships between the music and the audience, just because of the sheer amount of time that people spend with the music. Like it really just, and it's experiential because it's a memory of you doing something. It's not a memory of you watching a movie, or, it's not a passive memory. It's an active memory for the most part. So that has a different quality to it. And I think that's why there's such a strong link between music and games. And there's a really, people really gravitate to that stuff. They look at it in a way that's different than other mediums, I would say.
Yeah. Well, Rich, I love talking to you. Is there anything else perhaps about some of the projects that we've touched on, or anything else about your work that you'd like to bring up that I just don't want to leave anything unsaid? It's okay if not, if we've...
There's nothing specific that comes to mind. Man.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and Rich, I mean, thank you so much thank you for taking the time. I really enjoy your music, and you know, I will continue to enjoy it, and I just look forward to see what you're doing next.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, I think that is about it for the show. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Music Buds. Check out themusicbuds.com. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll see you next time.